Hallelujah.
Welcome to this episode of Dad Bod History. I'm Jake.
I'm Eric.
Hi, Cameron.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Fantastic.
Good.
Good. So we're doing episode 6 of Pandemic to Progress, and we kind of saved this one for last. It's on education and how this pandemic has changed education already, and how it's going to continue to change education possibly for generations. And so us all, either currently being a teacher or former teachers, we all have a whole lot to say and have some real world experience to apply to that. And I'm looking forward to it. But before we get into the topic at hand, just a real quick, how you guys been? It's been a couple weeks. Mainly my fault because I wasn't around. So sorry about that. Nobody wants to ask me about my trip. Or are you too upset?
No, how was your trip? How was your trip
nice.
to Wisconsin?
It was
To
nice.
not Eric's house.
To not California. Yeah.
Whatever.
Well, there was no gourmet gas stations, so that was disheartening.
How was the Echo?
I didn't go. It's
Wow.
pandemic. I'm not going to the Echo. That's
That makes sense.
yeah.
For a moment, I had forgotten about the pandemic because the Echo brings back
I
such
know.
good memories.
Sadly, the Echo is still suffering.
So, at Madison and Green Bay, or just Madison?
Just Madison. Yeah, but it's funny that I was just mentioning the gas stations, and when I got into Wisconsin, I stopped at the gas station that morning and grabbed a soda and then like a little one of those pre-made sandwiches or whatever, and then I looked at the cooler, and this is something I miss about Wisconsin so much, is that every gas station has tons of cheese curds that you can just grab. Like, they're always available. It's like the Takis of the Midwest. So that was nice. Got to see my uncle. Actually got to see a couple of my uncles, my aunt, cousin, her kids. It was a really good time. Had a great Friday night fish fry. Yeah, it was good. It was good to kind of get away because it's probably the last chance we'll have, at least until the end of the year. We aren't going to make any more big trips.
Was it just you, or did you take your whole family?
No, it was just me. My wife, she went to visit her family in June, and she went by herself, and I watched the kids that weekend, and so this was kind of my turn to go do that. We weren't going to fly the kids, because flying the kids under the best circumstances is not ideal. So, and it was interesting because it was both my flight to and from Wisconsin were packed to the gills. Everybody wore a mask. That was fine, but I mean, they were booked up flights. And it was funny, the day I left, I flew into O'Hare and drove to Madison, and that's where I flew back out. And the day I left, I think the order went out in Wisconsin that any travelers from Arizona would have to be under a 2-week quarantine. So I just made it, like I just got out to visit in time before I would have had to quarantine before I could even do anything in Wisconsin. So it was kind of lucky for me.
Yeah, when I was looking over the photos that you took in Madison, it's just obviously I live in Arizona, so there's not a lot of seasons here.
Yeah.
But the starkness of, my experience with Madison is a foot of snow on the ground and, below zero. And seeing those photos, it's just unbelievable. You forget that other places have seasons. I've been in Arizona long enough that I forget that there's seasons other than summer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like Arizona, especially Phoenix, is like summer and then less hot summer. But it's still summer. Like, it's never not summer in Arizona. When it's winter in December and it only gets up to 80, the rest of the country would kill to have those temperatures any time of the year.
So you guys hit 118 yesterday, didn't you?
God, it was brutal.
It's been brutal. Yeah.
It was terrible.
So.
But my AC hasn't broken in a full 2 weeks, so knock on wood.
That's what matters. So how you guys been? You been up to anything in the past 2 weeks?
Yeah, I got away to California. It's been the
Oh,
first
did you?
time in a long time. So
And
yeah,
you
I
didn't go
was
visit Eric?
as a crow
Oh.
flies.
What?
I was only about 50 miles away from Eric.
Oh.
There's just a lot of mountains in between us.
Gosh.
I thought about just taking a selfie and saying, "Hey, here's where I am." But
That's awesome.
Or were you back home?
yeah, I was back home. Yeah.
Yeah, we should have met up in like I can't even remember, Mojave or something.
Tehachapi.
Sounds lovely.
Tehachapi, yeah.
Yeah.
Barstow, all
There
those
you go.
wonderful places. Just
Yeah.
on the road next to Edwards Air Force Base. Yeah, we could have done that.
We could have visited a gourmet gas station.
Yeah.
They're not out there.
They don't exist in
No,
Barstow.
just in Bakersfield.
How about you, Eric? Anything going on the past couple weeks?
Not much. We started doing some planning here. We planned a trip at the end of August to go. We're gonna rent a cabin out at a campground just for a weekend. We haven't gotten away at all during this pandemic, so we're gonna do that. Just get the kids outdoors, out somewhere, and kind of enjoy the weekend. At some point, I'm coming back to Arizona for a weekend to pick up a tent trailer from my parents. So we're going to start using that out here to go camping.
Awesome.
So we're just trying to like plan that out and kind of get an idea of what we want to do with that, and something we want to start doing this year.
Does that mean that we could actually do a podcast all in person in the same room for the first time? I mean, if you're going to be out here in Phoenix.
Could we do it in the tent trailer? Could we do it in the...
Ooh, on location.
We could. It'd be on my parents' driveway. I mean, listen, if you guys wanted
Like,
to.
what is it? The Coast to Coast guy, he would say from an undisclosed location. in
Art
parts
Bell?
Unknown. Yes, Art Bell.
Oh. I mean, it'd have to be late at night. We could do that. It'll be on. My guess is I'll be driving out like on a Saturday morning and being there Saturday afternoon, kind of figuring it out. And so I'd be there Saturday night and then driving back Sunday. So we could.
I think it's great.
That'd be
So
groundbreaking.
I'll bring my stuff so we can be ready to do
It's going
that.
to be hard to get Nick out there. That'll be tough.
Mm.
Flights are pretty cheap right now.
Yeah. Awesome, man. That's so cool. I'm legit excited now for you to come. Do you know when that's going to be? Roughly?
My guess is my dad has to take care. Like, it's a 25-year-old tent trailer, but it's only been used a handful of times. So it just needs like tires and things to get checked before I take it. So, it's my parents taking really good care of it. So it's in good condition. And as our first foray into some type of RV camping, being that it'll be free,
It's hard to argue with that.
yeah, I mean, we'll take it. I remember camping in that thing, and it was, there's a king size bed on one side, a queen size on the other, and then like a twin where the table is. So, we'll try it out. We'll put some miles on it and try to get out and enjoy the outdoors.
That sounds awesome, man. So I think it's kind of interesting you bring that up because the last time we did the podcast, we were talking about entertainment and how we got to be creative during this pandemic to kind of do things that we wouldn't normally do as far as entertainment, like movies or going to tourist traps or like Disney World or Universal Studios. And I think, Cameron, you alluded to the fact that getting outside more was something that had happened in your family. And so similarly, I think you're kind of taking that same vein, Eric, which is really cool.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. All right. Well, without further ado, let's get on to the topic of the day, education, and specifically how this pandemic has changed education, I guess, already, currently, how different schooling is at every level. from preschool daycare to universities. And there's been a lot going on. And it seems like, Eric, you said before we started recording, almost every day there's something new coming out. Either certain unions are making requests, or school districts are changing their directives, or
requests. That's what we'll call them.
Are we going back to
mostly peaceful requests?
Yeah. Are we going back to school full time? Is it going to be distance learning or online education? And every state does things differently, and many of the districts within each state do things differently. And so it's just been this constant flux of how are we going to go back to school? But then also I want to talk about is once this crisis is over and things get back to normal, whatever that normal is, how will education in America continue to change and continue to be different? Because I think, much like many of the other things we talked about, I think going back to the way things were isn't going to happen. And so I think those are the two main topics I want to hit. But I think first of all, let's kind of talk about how things are different now, the changes we're seeing now, and I guess our reactions to that, and then we'll get into once the pandemic is over. So with that, I guess I don't have any initial thoughts, so I'll hand it off to you, Eric.
I think one of the important things to really consider when we talk about education is we have to look at where we were 6 months ago.
Okay.
And kind of look at the status quo. Maybe I hesitate to use that word status quo, but where we were 6 months ago, 90% of K-12 students in the United States were educated in a public school setting of some sort. And the remaining 10%, a large majority were in either private, parochial, Christian, Catholic, Lutheran schools, some, secular private schools, charter schools, and homeschooling. And so that's kind of where things stood before this happened. And we kind of, the past 20 years, I'm about to go into my 17th year of education. Past 20 years, at least from what I understand, and probably further beyond that, is there's always been some contention between traditional public education at the district level and state level and all those different levels, and all the other settings of school. Mm-hmm. Because they're vying for seats, they're vying for bodies. For public schools, a student in the seat who's enrolled and in attendance is money in their pocket. And that's not a malicious thing. That's just simply, that's how most districts allot their funding. The students have to be not only enrolled but also present. So attendance matters. And so students who disenroll from public schools for whatever reason is money away from that district or money away from that school. And so there's always been some contention between, public schools and other types of schools. But there's always there's been a stabilization over the past few years, I'd say. Although I'd say unions and public school teachers generally push, and I had this experience in on my daughter's soccer team when she played. The coach was a public school teacher, and one of the parents was a public school teacher, but she knew I didn't teach in public schools, and she started saying, private school teachers don't need to be this, they don't need to be this, they're not qualified, and the parents like, well, Eric, what do you think? How does your private school operate? And I was just like, well, I mean, I guess I'd say I'm qualified. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree. I have a handful of other certifications. I mean, I don't know what would not make me qualified. So, I've had those interesting conversations too. But now, I think things are changing very rapidly, and there's a lot more contention between especially the unions themselves, and in particular some teachers who are very pro-union, and kind of the talking points they're taking towards education, versus what I'm seeing on some of the Facebook groups and Twitter groups for private and parochial education and homeschooling. There's a lot flying around, and like you said, it changes from day to day, so it's hard to tell what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, Eric, and all three of us are private school guys, quote unquote, that we believe in the private school system. But, very much there is that divisiveness between public and private. And I have felt like there's a movement to do your duty, quote unquote, and send your kids to public school. And because of the funding, because this school is going to get worse for everybody if you don't send your kids to that school. And, the mask thing is very divisive, but schools are starting to be that way too. Everybody's got an opinion, and everybody, that can get pretty contentious pretty quickly.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And charters kind of throw a whole other, I guess, monkey wrench into the mix, because it's no longer public versus private. It's now public versus charter versus private, and they're all kind of working, if not against each other, definitely independent from one another. And another thing you brought up, Eric, that I thought was interesting is you said 90% before the pandemic, 90% of all students were educated in public schools. I would say there's probably similar numbers, but probably about 90% or more of all students were also educated in a building prior to this pandemic. And I think that's another thing.
Well, I'd say it's more like 99. I mean, because when you talk about the private schools, whether they're parochial or not parochial, and whether it's a charter or just a private, I don't know what the actual percentage of homeschool students are, but those are the ones that generally are not educated on site. Now, there's some online schools, online charters, and online public schools, but that's probably closer to 1% that are not educated on a site.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you see so much of the push being made by these online schools. We forget, I think the average person in public forgets, that education is an industry. Education is a business, and there's a lot of money at stake in each of those three different avenues, I guess.
Yeah, and I just looked up, I mean, this is not going to school entirely, but approximately 1/3 of all students take at least one online class. But again, that's
K-12?
Yeah, that's K-12. That could
I'm guessing that
could be a bunch of high
school
schoolers.
Heavy, yeah. Probably not too many kindergartners.
Credit. Yeah. So it doesn't say how many are doing all their education online. But there is a significant chunk that do some sort of online learning. But the point being is, prior to March, we'll say, everybody went to a building to go to school. And everybody went into a classroom to do their education. Of those, the overwhelming majority went to public schools. And I think one of the articles I looked up said about 6% of students are educated at a charter. That would leave about 4% educated in some sort of private or parochial school. So that kind of gives you some rough numbers of what we're looking at.
When we talk about students going to a building, we're also talking about there's a component to education which includes supervision, which, again, we might get into discussion about what's the real purpose of education, regardless of what we can agree on as being the big purpose. One of the services provided with education, as we've seen over the past 150 years in this country, is a form of supervision. Mm-hmm. And with that comes also kind of behavior development and behavior learning. So it's not just that they go to a building, it's that they're at a building and supervised by adults that generally are trained in how to deal with children of all these different ages and their behaviors, and how to model things for them, and how to provide examples and help them work in social groups, right? So that whole piece has been taken away from education, or taken out of education during this time.
Yeah. And it's funny, well, and I guess there's a lot we can get into and how things are going to change. So I'll put a pin on what I want to say there. But, I think now that we kind of have a general idea of what we were, what are we now? Like, what has changed now? And Cameron and I aren't still in teaching right now, but you are. And how are things different at your profession personally? And what are you seeing universally, or trends across the country that have kind of popped up to you, good or bad, or just interesting?
Well, so I'll just start with myself. We're intending to go back in person. We're committed to going as far as we can within the state's guidelines. We want to go in person because we know that at my school, and generally in the schools that the three of us have taught at, one of the objectives is not simply educating the mind, but also educating, the body and the soul. And a lot of that requires face-to-face interactions in groups. And so we're committed to that because we know it's really hard to maintain some of that virtually or by distance. So for me personally, one of the things that I've kind of worked on this summer is building some of my coursework. And all of it was digital already, but it was just documents. So I've spent some time building, using some tools. We used Google Classroom. I wouldn't say it was the ideal system. There's some other ones out there that I'm looking at, some learning management systems, LMSs, and trying to look at how to build my coursework on there so that whether we go back in person or go back teaching virtually, like live streaming, the coursework is all in one place and is accessible to students, and is kind of like laid out in a way that students can use it. And we can also discuss online if we need to, and we can kind of track things better. So whether we go back in person, I'll still use that. If we have to shut down or we don't go back in person, I'll still use that. So I'll be working off the same platform. The difference is, will I be in a room with these students or not? Being in the room allows for more enriching activities, although I'm still limited. I mean, I'm thinking about some of the things that I used to do, and I'm not going to be able to do them just because they require students to gather around a single surface, a table. And that's going to be one thing that we're going to be de-emphasizing or working away from, because shared surfaces are problematic. So I'm just trying to reimagine some activities, because I think, as I've always taught, I wanted things to be very active and back and forth. So that's where my biggest adjustment is how to keep the engagement up when there can't be that kind of activity in the room.
And I think that's, on a personal level, I think that's probably one of the more dramatic shifts that a lot of teachers and a lot of schools are going to be going through, is how do I provide the same content in an engaging and meaningful way than I did before. And there's going to be a lot of people that struggle with that. I think that's going to be a big hurdle to get over. And how different districts and how different states respond to that question is going to really push things forward generations from now. I think that's going to be the biggest, how do teachers deal with it individually, and then how does that shape school policy in the future is going to be a big change that I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if anybody knows what that answer is going to be, but it's definitely going to be something that we're all going to watch.
And I think it's interesting too. Not every teacher takes that approach of, hey, how can I get better? How can I tweak things? How can I meet the needs in this changing world? I think, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself for the future, but this is going to likely weed out teachers that are there for the wrong reasons. Because that exists in every profession, obviously. But when we talked about the teachers' unions just briefly earlier, there are teachers out there that are trying to do whatever they can to not show up in the fall, or are making demands that are very unlikely to be met. And from a parent perspective, a lot of parents are like, yeah, we're just in survival mode. So I'm not in a classroom anymore. I'm not employed by a school, but I am in education. And I talk with parents oftentimes of children that are struggling academically. And school is kind of an afterthought right now. For so many parents whose children are struggling, it's, wow, this is actually a good thing that we can take our foot off the gas pedal, and they don't maybe have that long-term perspective. They're just grateful for the break because they're working themselves. And I think that gets lost too often in this whole thing. You look at John Q. Public looks at the typical kid and the average kid that just gets through school and doesn't necessarily have issues or problems, but there are so many kids. If you look at the numbers, I think it's 14% receive special services, be it an IEP or special education or that kind of thing. That's a big number. When you extrapolate that nationwide, those are the kids I think that are really going to get lost in the shuffle, unfortunately, because of overwhelmed teachers and overwhelmed parents and an overwhelmed system.
Yeah, that's another part of the kind of status quo discussion is some of the things that schools do that aren't education. That includes, in some places, breakfast, lunch, and dinner for some kids in some neighborhoods. They're providing a place that's away from and safe from, could be their neighborhood, their community, even their families. 8 hours away from that can be instrumental in helping them kind of figure out a path out of, detrimental behaviors. And those were all parts, they were all built in. And there's still, every district that serves those meals still has to keep serving those meals through the pandemic. So while teachers, in many cases, or teachers' unions are claiming that their teachers feel unsafe and that they can't go back to work, it is a health and safety issue. The food workers from those schools and districts are still working because they have a mandate to keep providing that food for free. And so here we have this shift in what does it mean to provide free access to public education.
Yeah.
And the argument that I'm hearing is, as long as we're providing the content and the instruction, the location and means of said instruction are not deal breakers, I guess. And so, you can do your job, which is a salaried job with benefits. To, I know teachers, we often say we don't pay teachers enough. I've never really thought that I was unfairly compensated. I've never felt that way. And my pay is usually, and you guys understand this, our pay has usually been about 90% of our local public system. So I've never felt unfairly compensated for my work. But to say that the job is simply curating content and delivering it would be false.
Mm-hmm.
And when a local district in where I live, when we shut down, and their response was simply the teachers made copies of all the remaining content and handed it to the students. And that was it.
Mm-hmm.
That was elastic for some of the teachers. I'm sure some teachers did go out of their way, made phone calls, made Zoom calls, conference with students, but some handed it off and said, that's it. And took 2.5 months off.
Yeah. And it's funny, though. I think what you alluded to there, and I think this whole thing has taught me, is how flat-footed our country got caught by this pandemic. Although, this is an aside, ironically enough, it was George W. Bush, I think in 2004 or 5, that tried to create a pandemic response plan because he said this is devastating. And then for whatever reason, there's a bunch of reasons it didn't get built to fruition. But I think in education especially, we're seeing how, and again, who can predict a crisis like this, but how if something happens to where kids can't go to school in the future, school systems across the country, public, private, or otherwise, need to be able to look at it and say, well, how can we provide this service, because that's what it is, it's a service,
Mm-hmm.
in unconventional circumstances. And I think it's the duty of public schools, because the whole mandate of a public school is to be able to provide free education to all. But I also think it's within the prerogative of private and charter schools to also have that contingency plan, because we're all learning as we go right now. Schools and administrators and teachers and students and parents, we're all figuring it out in the dark as we go. And some are doing a great job, and others are failing miserably. And part of that is an unpreparedness, not necessarily their fault, because, like I said, who can predict this? But it's definitely something we need to learn from.
In some districts, you're going to find a very low rate of connectivity. So you can't do Zoom calls and conference meetings via some video conference method. In other places, you do have that, and that's just kind of, that's the way that's generally going to be. And the flat-footedness, part of that is we have these monoliths in the United States. And I do keep harping on the unions, but and you said it in our text this morning, Jake. It's not just education where we have these monolithic powerhouses, whether they're unions or lobby groups, that just insist on fighting change. They resist change because that change threatens some sense of power or some power that they have. That makes you flat-footed. When the health industry or the health insurance industry lobbies against rules and laws that would simplify purchasing of health insurance across state lines, it's doing so for its own benefit. And again, I don't think that's necessarily malicious. It's just kind of that invisible hand. Teachers' unions are going to operate in a way that protects themselves. The union, not necessarily the teachers, protects the union. And so it's going to say, hold on, we can't change too much. Keep your kid enrolled in public schools. We know that we're providing half of the service, being we're providing educational materials and content and instruction, but we're not providing the supervision or, the
food service or
the food service. That's mandated; they have to. But the teachers aren't providing the supervision. But we can't change any salaries. We can't change any pay. The same is true in tax law. There's a lobby of tax accountants, tax accountants, that basically the lobby fights against simplified tax code. Because if the tax code was simplified and I could do it in 5 minutes, they'd be out of a job. Again, this is just, we have this habit of this kind of protectionism in the United States, and it makes it hard in a lot of cases to pivot very quickly because we're trying to protect people and protect certain jobs. So it makes it's a detriment, or it's an obstacle to innovation.
And I would,
and I know that Eric and Jake, both of you, this is years ago. You've had that outlook of kind of looking at education through a capitalistic lens. And what does capitalism do very well is innovate. And hopefully one of these consequences of the pandemic in a positive way is going to be that a band of dual income families where both mom and dad are working decide to hire a teacher in the neighborhood to teach their children, and perhaps we go back to a one-room schoolhouse type situation of yesteryear. And from a teacher's perspective, what are the two biggest issues in public school? It's teacher pay and class size. But
So I'm gonna jump on that because I know where you're going, and I want to get there.
Okay.
But I'm gonna throw something your way that I threw to Jake, and it was kind of an anecdote I heard today, and that a parent who, and they're not even a dual income family. They're well off, I think. It's the story was kind of murky to me, but
so this is an actual story?
yeah. So I heard
Okay.
this from someone. Basically, one parent was very frustrated that school didn't look like it was going to be back in session, and was speaking to someone and asked if their significant other, who is a public school teacher, would be willing to tutor their children full time.
Mhm.
And so I ran this by Jake, and I kind of, it didn't strike me until much later after the conversation. So this would be a public school teacher who is pulling full pay and benefits to do distance learning. And I assume that they would have some work to do from 8 to 3. But during 8 to 3, they would also be tutoring privately, basically providing the daycare service to a handful of students in their home. And my issue there is the free market would allow for that. But my issue is an ethical issue, being if you're a teacher who's being paid full pay and benefits, and especially if you're arguing that you need to stay home for the health and safety of yourself and students, and then you are going the other direction and privately tutoring up to 10 students in your home at the risk of your own health and the health of those students, it's a big ethical issue for me. Now, you're getting at...
I think that depends, though, on what your stance is. If you're refusing to go back to work on the grounds of pandemic, then yes, I have a total issue with that. But if this is what my district is doing, and I'm a teacher that's not very well paid, I'm going to be opportunistic there and say, sure, I'm going to do this if I can earn some extra money. I think it really varies on what your personal opinion is there. But yeah, I get what you're saying.
part of it, and I like that, and I think what we're about to get into is more of how things are going to be different post-pandemic, especially with what you're suggesting, Cameron. And but I do want to say, and maybe this is going to upset Eric, in defense of unions,
Here we go.
especially these teachers, is a lot of times it's not the teachers saying I'm not going to go back, but you still have to pay me. They're doing what the union is directing them to do.
Right. Yeah.
Because that's how it works. Like, and that's unions. That's not just education unions. That's
Right.
unions in the
Yeah.
auto industry. That's police officers, firefighters, any sort of union. They get their direction from the union leaders, and they say, all right, well, this is what we're doing, and that's part of how we negotiate and collectively bargain. And it's not like they say, I don't want to teach your kid, but I want these things, and that's the whole reason unions exist, is they can collectively bargain with large corporations, or in this case, with state and local governments.
Yeah, and so we can, I agree. Again, this is not necessarily teachers doing this, although EduTwitter is alight with these
Yeah.
teachers who simply are demanding these things. And listen, I get it. That a lot of them are like, well, here's what my classroom looks like, 3 feet distance. Here's what my classroom looks like, 6 feet distance. It doesn't work. We need some directives. And I get that. There's some that are just like, we refuse to go back. And again, how much of that is genuinely from those teachers? How much of it is coming as a directive from union? But here's what the LA Unified Teachers Union put in their demands. And this was literally, we recorded 2 weeks ago, gentlemen. This was the next day, so I'm so glad we didn't cover it 2 weeks ago. LA Unified, for them to come back, they're demanding the police be defunded, Medicare for all, and ban on charter schools in LA Unified. Now, which of those three, if any, have anything to do with COVID health and safety? And so someone asked me back in May, they said, what's your big black helicopter theory on all this? And I said, listen, I'm not wearing a tin hat on this. However, unions and similar groups, corporations included, are opportunistic. And when a crisis hits, when the pressure is on, that's when you apply more pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And why the teachers union thinks defunding the police and Medicare for all and banning charter schools is necessary to get them back to school is beyond me. But that's their pressure point, and they're going to use it. Because the big question here is, what are parents going to do in 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks from now?
Yeah.
And where do these things go?
Yeah.
And I, Cameron, you said we generally take a capitalist approach, say a free market approach. I think capitalist tends to say corporations are not free of these same antics and tactics of using large group power to push things. And that's where my argument, unions, when you want to have a private union with a corporation, go for it. When it's public union, the thing is the money never runs out because it can always tax us more. So that's where public unions tend to irritate me a little bit more.
But and maybe this is, we don't, although not so much now. Okay, we don't have an issue with firefighter unions. We used to not really have an issue with police unions, although the past 6 months has kind of changed a lot of people's views on.
Well, the firefighters unions are getting used to not being out in front right now. So
yeah, so I think it's.
I mean, the firefighters union,
public,
they had a big issue back in the 80s with Reagan.
Union, yeah, and well, the air traffic controller, and then he fired them all. So
yeah, I mean, the firefighters union as well. He threatened them. So.
But I don't think the idea of unions collectively bargaining is a bad thing, because if you're going to work for the government, then it's either you just take whatever the government gives you, which I guess is one thing, or you're allowed to collectively bargain. And I don't think teachers being able to collectively bargain is a bad thing on its face. I do think, like anything, unions can become corrupt, and in some instances they can become too political. And some of the demands you just listed for the LA Unified Union are definitely, those are political demands. They aren't necessarily actual.
You could argue Medicare for all hits the the
Yeah.
the needs, Maslow's
Hierarchy
hierarchy of
of
needs,
needs.
Yeah.
right? So like, okay, Medicare for maybe that does okay. All right, I'll there's one. I'll say that one can be in your camp.
Mm-hmm.
But the others, you're
But the others are political, and they're
Yeah.
political in nature, and that's an issue when any union or lobbying group or corporation throws things in, and they're really doing it more to signal to other camps, "Hey, I'm with you guys, so support me over here," and that's a whole other episode we could go off on. However, the principle behind
bust those
unions.
unions.
Yeah, and I guess maybe that's my background. Is when I grew up in Wisconsin, is the teachers' unions were very strong, and I remember then they would protest outside my school during collective bargaining, and then they
Did
go
you
in
ever
and teach.
Did you ever have class, or were they just always protesting?
Hey, we ranked way better than Arizona. So, but that's what they do. They'd have they'd stand outside the school before class started. They'd protest, and they'd go in and they teach. And then if the negotiations didn't do well, then they would threaten to call in sick, and then eventually they would threaten to, if it continued to not go well, then they would strike. The funny thing is they never really had to strike because they had the union and the state government, which was run by Tommy Thompson at this time, a Republican governor, had a good enough working relationship that they were able to get their jobs done and still keep the schools open.
Yeah,
The whole point I'm saying is I don't like to paint unions with a broad brush.
I do, obviously.
I know you do, and that's why I'm saying this. However, I think before we went into that talk, what I thought was really interesting that you both were kind of talking about is what we're, I think they're called micro schools now,
Mhm.
right? That's the new term.
Or school pods or something like
Yeah,
that.
where basically one teacher and a small group of students, be it in their neighborhood or whatever, they could get the funding for that student and teach. So you're reducing overhead, you're reducing obviously classroom size, and
Teacher pays.
personalized instruction.